this, they had a broad network of supporters. And one of their tools for the struggle was to elaborate the plan, a popular plan for the village. And but despite all that, most of the community was removed, but they also built the political subject and political struggle that was very important, with many assembly meetings and field surveys, documental surveys, workshops, and making collective decisions. And here I bring some of the images of the struggle. Together we are stronger. And the residents were organized before the threat to be removed. And they had grassroots participation of the whole village. And this is the final version of the plan. It always demonstrated, and it made the dispute, we're demonstrating clearly that the community could stay. There was no need for its removal, and also making it possible to build the Olympic Park, because it, with this final version of the plan, you could have them, but most of the community was removed, although some people remained in the area. The other story, the other case is Vargens, the urban operation, when they had a consortium with the city government for the Olympic Games in 2016. It's a very large area in the western zone of Rio, with more than 40 communities that articulated in this popular plan for Vargens. And there was an inspiration and an experience in the, they used the experience of the Autódromo village, and Camorim, Barra da Tijuca, Vargem Pequena, Recreio dos Bandeirantes, Vargem Grande, and it drew the attention. Although in this moment we have uh, there were activists, agroecological organization, quilombos, and they all participated in this initiative. We have some images of the participatory meetings with the map. We can see the place. We can see Vargem Grande, Vargem Pequena, the whole area where they want to have real estate developments in this area, the gigantic projects. And here we have the plan that was elaborated together with the community. And there they put the whole issue of quilombolas, the areas of social interest. And then we can speak a little bit more about this.
Uma reflexão sobre essa questão do...
Going back to a reflection about the cartographic production at the popular level, I think it's interesting with this whole participatory mapping, popular cartography, that these maps that derive from these plans, they are an invitation to participatory cartography that reflect the emergence of cartographic policies and mapping. They are the object of political action, and the cartographic products from Vila Autódromo and Vargens, they demonstrated their element of resistance and protest, strengthening the areas, and they became political subjects in these cases. So if we think of this aspect of transformation, change, political learning, cartography integrated to a planning process that in an area of conflict, but that is participatory. It wants to link the territories, link everyone to the territory, build the territory with the actors and mobilize the actors through the territory. In this relationship, people can be transformed according to the political actions. Because of the territorial issues, they have different representational languages, techniques of representation, and the uses of the results. So the production of popular plans, alternative plans, master plans from the grassroots, it shows the participation and the decisions that really affect the threatened populations. And it has to do with their housing. However, in the alternative plans, they are an object of political action. If we think of political action as something that has to do with the division of the social world, we can consider that in the policy of plans and alternative mapping, you establish a dispute with different representations of the space, a cartographic dispute that articulates with the disputes of about territory. So we have this aspect, which I think is very important and interesting in the appropriation of this experience, but it's important to stress that this participatory situation comes marked by an ambiguity to give a voice to the grassroots communities. And in its realization, it shows it's independent from the power structure where it is established. So I think I'm going to conclude here. Fernanda, I imagine this is my time limit. And if we have an opportunity, we can discuss this a little further in the debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luis Regis. Now I give the floor to Renato Emerson dos Santos. Good morning to all the people who are following us up in the seminar. I'm going to present here a PowerPoint. Can you see it? Yes. I gave a title to activism cartographic disputes in Rio de Janeiro, to focus the cartographic disputes within the process of building of Rio de Janeiro. In the case of the Maravilha port, I'd like to include in this presentation, I worked with 3 points. Not a very systematic script, but I'd like to involve these 3 issues. First, the displacement. We have the enlarging, as Regis mentioned, the cartography for social control, and that was developed as a tool of dominance, and was this appropriated by hegemonic groups as a struggle tool. And based on this, I have proposed the idea of cartographic activism with different forms of action in the counter-hegemonic cartography, which makes me closer to this discussion and to make it part of the conflictual planning and the contradictions that are developed within this process in the Olympic Rio de Janeiro. In the case of the maps war, as Wagner said, the idea of the maps war. My starting point is this: counter-hegemonic appropriations in cartography. This is part of a larger project that occurred in the last few decades to value the phenomena, processes, and some authors have say there is a growing valuing, a production of narratives and intervention in processes based on spatial observation. This growth of cartography by a larger and larger quantity, an increasingly larger quantity of social actors with a cartographic turnover, this displacement and enlargement of the cartography, as it used to be a tool controlled by the states, corporations, as Regis mentioned. Now it has been opening space in a new regime of relations in the field of cartographic production, involving a series of practices of social struggles with social movements and with cartographies made by social movements and about social movements, producing a process, a double process. On the one hand, cartography is more increasingly present in the disputes for territory and city growth. It's used by the groups, and cartography becomes an object of dispute about the norms and forms of production of cartography. This engenders what I call cartographic activism, different forms of action, of cartographic gesture that has been substituted by a plurality of subjects, cartographs, geographers, architects, hackers, cyber activists, communities, and also by collectives that associate to groups that are under a process of dispute, different forms of conflict and spatial conflict in labs of research, and they constitute a plurality of activists. The cartographic activism inserts the struggles within the experiences of cartographic production in the process of territorial disputes. And they are disputes about the norms, the forms, the tools, and the models of cartographic production through an emergency of cartographic practices with references that are cultural, of groups that are mapped in an attempt to subvert the cartography that it was traditional from the northern part of the globe, and the icons that exist that in fact produce and reproduce the affirmation of the Eurocentric world. The cartographic conventions are somehow a rationale that shows a specific experience. And in that sense, that cartography is a tool of knowledge and power. The technological tools dispute the hegemonic forms of production. If on the one hand, we have great corporations and in the cartographic production, producing interactive tools of friendly interface, easily apprehensible, and part of the social struggles, and controlling the production processes. They allow some things, but not others. And they, in the same way, they prevent other types of spatial rationale and other technological tools, mathematics, and not only produce other tools, but dispute these tools and the technological models of cartographic production and social models that have to do with the way by which cartographers dominate this production as in relation to the cartographed groups. We have collaborations, social cartography, a series of other forms of sharing the power of the process to make cartography. In fact, we don't have only the emergence of different forms of participation, but also disputes of models of power models, of power relations models, including the appropriation of the cartographic models. These processes are full of contradictions. We see groups that use these tools as a process of disseminating, geolocalizing in our daily lives. The groups are using these cartographic tools exactly from the hegemonic corporations, with the monitoring, vigilance, and control of behaviors based on the dissemination of these technologies. And in specific disputes in the Porto Maravilha, in the Maravilha port, we have cartographic or disputes of representation and space significance. Here are the official cartography and the colonization of the imaginary. Rio is a global city, and they project a city that is mercantilized in, and there we have the building of cartography as a form of colonizing the imagination. These projects are called revival or urban renewal, representing an understanding of these, and the capital promotes colonization of the imagination. And there's a set of cartographic pieces that are produced. We have other groups disputing. This is the map about violations of the rights in the port region. The Maravilha means wonderful. So it's wonderful for whom, the sport? So there's always disputes in this territory with the maps war, with the plan of removal, the counter based on the environmental consideration or final report on the environment. the geological risks. And this, we have this project with respect to the Afro-Brazilian culture and the heritage of the African culture. They revealed that what used to be the small Africa is much more than this. We have other places of memory to understand, and we have cartographic experiences for that. We have groups of the public agency. If on the one hand, the hegemonic project has one of the major tools to create a new area in the city called the Museum of Tomorrow, they want to create a museum of yesterday, where they will create the tour showing other dimension of this territory, of the slavery from the past, that dimension of the presence of the samba, the Afro-Brazilian population, and the process of production of the Port Maravilha. So this appropriation, and I'm about to finish, it has created different forms and processes that many times contribute for the mercantilization. And right now, we have the pandemic, and we see other forms of appropriation of cartographic problems or production with to confront this macro policy that we have in Brazil right now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Renato. So now I give the floor to Pablo Mancia. We will have to stop the English translation just for a few moments, please.
E para mim é muito interessante também construir diálogo com todos vocês, já que eu já estive morando no Rio de Janeiro faz tempo e conheci muitas dessas experiências que vocês estão falando e que nós também trouxemos para o Chile para começar a fazer coisas interesantes como essas. Voy a hablar en español el resto de mi presentación, que es mi lengua materna. Hace tiempo que no hablo portugués, así que continuaré en español. Primero que todo, en conexión a lo que ya estaban comentando los expositores anteriores, encontramos que los mapas contienen un discurso de poder y hay un descontento que empieza a acontecer con mucha fuerza en los mapas a partir de lo que se ha dicho respecto a ellos en torno a su visión fría, alejada de la realidad, las universalizaciones espaciales que realizan de las representaciones locales.
We are opening again the English translation, and we have interesting experiences in Latin America that have to do with the building of cartographies. There are some experiences of collectives in Mexico, maps that are icon and class-oriented in the context of Canada, with a network that puts together researchers from all of Latin America, and also a series of very interesting experiences from which we can learn in the last few years. The new Amazonic cartography made by Professor Wagner, among other experiences. So I recommend to all of you that this was done by the collective Orangotango, a collective from Germany. And we have recent cartography about indigenous peoples and part of our experiences in indigenous territory, and some references that seem to be important, a very important book that is called Community Geographies, that David Jimenez. Based on all of these experiences, there is a process of renewal. There's a cartography in Latin America, and we have to reflect upon this and develop experiences in each one of these realms, especially the work group as alternative spaces where we work. And at least we developed 4 realms where we recognize first the counter cartography, using all this information through analysis. They are not using all the cartography of bioactivism and through hacking too, in order to generate a closeness with the community. And the second is the cartographic geography, the critical one, in the realm of the cultural cartography, to work with knowledge and local knowledge. I'd like to speak. The first one, the cartography used as a political tool, where we will have the process of territorial autonomy. For this purpose, it's fundamental to have the work of Orlando Fassborger, Falsborda, and he talks about the participatory participatory cartography that has a space of debate and collective building of knowledge that helps to follow up the emancipatory processes. Our work in this discussion group we have for alternative territories works with dialogue, the neocolonial cartography, and the creative cartography. We have used different tools, but also new technologies using online information, cartographic information. And we started our work in 2013 in Venezuela, working with indigenous peoples and different peoples that were discussing an autonomous education process. And we came back to Chile in 2015 to work with many of these tools. And we created a space that was very inspired in the work of getting to know the experience of popular planning. It was interesting to finish these. There are some images of slums that worked in this. One of the most extensive work we did with a Mapuche organization, the Territorial Mapuche Alliance. They had the mapping to recover their territory and the strengthening of relations between culture and territory. We will have to stop the English translation because we are having a technical problem.
La cartografía aparece en territorio mapuche desde finales del siglo XIX como un objeto que permite entonces controlar los territorios sobre los cuales se despliega el colonialismo interno. Estos son algunos de los mapas que aparecen durante aquella época, que comienzan a subdividir las tierras indígenas para su posterior remate. ¿Qué es lo que comenzamos a hacer? Trabajamos entonces con las herramientas de cartografía cultural mapuche con el objetivo de poder reconstruir esas territorialidades que han sido negadas por el colonialismo interno. Para eso hacemos una adaptación de la investigación de acción participativa y de las metodologías de grupos focales a partir de una relectura de aquellas metodologías desde la perspectiva propia mapuche. ¿Qué quiere decir eso? Utilizando, por ejemplo, las estructuras conversacionales y las formas de organización y debate político que ya existen precedentemente en estos espacios de trabajo. Aquí algunas imágenes de nuestro trabajo. Comúnmente buscamos que los jóvenes sean actores partícipes, que sean ellos quienes diseñan los mapas, como una forma también de crear un espacio de transmisión generacional entre los saberes y los conocimientos territoriales. También vamos principalmente a las fuentes de la voz indígena, de la voz de los ancianos de las comunidades como las principales referencias. Usamos diferentes tipos de metodologías, a veces materiales análogos, otras veces digitales, pero también tratamos siempre de dar un sentido visual a nuestro trabajo. Este es uno de los primeros mapas que logramos conseguir, es un mapa del territorio ancestral mapuche, y lo primero que puede llamar la atención es que precisamente el mapa está orientado hacia el este, ¿cierto? Al contrario de las cartografías convencionales orientadas hacia el norte. Esta es la referencia espacial que se usa.
This is the space reference that is used in the perspective of the Mapuche knowledge in order to orient by the place where the sun rises, and also to get to know our territory. In Argentina and Chile, it's Gulumapu, and in Argentina, it's Pelmapu. So these territories overlap the national states. So on the Chilean side, it's a broken map where different indigenous territories are. Today, the forest, extractivism, and the different communities, this is the growth of pinus and eucalyptus in the region. And there's conflicts in Chile within the pandemic and the neoliberal policy that is happening there. We had a state of exception in indigenous territory, and they started out a process of militarization, denying the rights of human rights of the community. What is the role of maps? This is a map created with a bourgeois view to represent the Mapuche territory. This is a map that denounces showing the places where violence happened and by the police almost in 1 decade. We also worked liberating information about the hydroelectric dams, and that has been invaded. They are being, these territories have been declared investment territories, and they belong to the Mapuche. So they understand that cartography is not the ultimate solution, but it follows up the process of social mobilization. This is our workshop, and these are some of the issues. Why do we speak about decolonization of the map? Because we think cartography must be participatory, and it must start from references. And in this book, we had designed the concept of nature and of a border, the concept of territory, and this creates a Mapuche perspective. All of these elements and all of these feelings of being in a space are a challenge for the traditional cartography. These are some of the aspects that show this tridimensional aspect: nature, memory, history, the social, the community, the subsistence, and the political space. We work with a methodology that tries to build the that recovers the we propose to have a cartography with these aspects. Our methodology is based upon three large spheres of action. The first one is as strategy of recovery of water in indigenous territories, and it has to do with cultural territorial practices. What is this? Identifying the place, the sites of cultural significance and political and cultural marks based on meeting places where this is happening. And most of all, everything that has to do with the spiritual recovery of these territories that are infected by extractivism. Secondly, cartography must have a territorial control on the part of the communities. Also, we work with the counter information and the spaces of the social media. There is also sabotage and direct sabotage against them. We also work with political allies that to fight the scaling of the problem, and as a space of dialogue and knowledge with science, using tools that allow us to have this territorial knowledge. These are some of the images of the spaces that are marked with celebrations and communities that are recovering that territory. And for us, this is fundamental as a sacred space. I already finished my time frame, the space of cartography as a transmission, intergenerational transmission. The young people are listening to the stories because they will have to sustain all this knowledge about their territory. Sometimes the maps are not so beautiful, but they always bring about results. This is the map of all the spaces that are named in spiritual um, in spiritual aspects. They're large volcanoes or mountains that are important, and they are shared as cultural significant place sites. Also, we work on toponymia, looking for old ancestors' names with the delimitation of ancestors' situation to see what was the level of territorial. And finally, we work with everything that has to do with the expression of Mapuche territoriality, the old cemeteries, the old pathways, and the spiritual references that appear in the territory. This is a way of naming the rivers that are being threatened. What we attained is we were able to paralyze 13 hydroelectric dams. It was an effective model, and we are taking this to different territories to show that this political victory is taking this learning process to other places. We also had the recognition of the Nobel Prize on the environment based on a prize for Alberto Curamil, because he had this participatory. There's a lot more, but I'll leave it for later on. Thank you very much.
Antes de passar para o Juan Grabois, eu queria comunicar que recebemos uma mensagem do Oren Iftachel, que infelizmente não vai poder estar conosco. Hoje é dia de eleições em Israel, ele está isolado no Negev, ele inclusive emprestou o carro pro
He actually lent his car to a few people from of the tribe that he follows. He sent everyone his greetings. So just that everyone knows that after Juan, we will now give you the floor, okay? Juan Grabois, who will now share his presentation with Fernanda Minho.
Hola, voy a tratar de prender la cámara. Hola.
Hello, good morning. Good, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. My name is Juan Grabois from the Popular Economy Workers Union. I am with Fernanda Minho, who will speak after me. I'm going to speak quite briefly. Our organization comprises workers with no bosses from the rural and urban areas. Workers without bosses. We didn't choose this autonomy or emancipation situation of choice. But because of the exclusion from the field of work, this is what has happened. Now, in general, this exclusion coincides with that of the real estate market, which usually includes the homeless. There are many exclusions, and our organization that works mainly with work issues, be it for people who collect recyclable garbage, as it were, or who sell their wares in the streets, and for example, those who work in daycare centers or any other area of that kind. We have simply had to map out, we had to go to the work, actually take the trouble of map out the settlements and slums in the popular areas of our town. This was very practically done. This mapping was to identify the maps, to identify the areas that existed in each uh, neighborhood, the domiciles that fit within each block, in order to promote a legislation that allowed at least some security in terms of possession for those over 600,000 Cavita families, around 6 million people. We were lucky actually in this mobilization process because it enabled us to promote a breakthrough law, which was that of the expropriation of the 4,000 odd land masses that our brothers and sisters live in, regardless of the owner. It could be one or multiple owners, but each brother or sister would have a plot of land recognized by the state as a popular area, popular neighborhood, and receive a certificate of family housing, which in legal terms is like a deed of title, a deed of ownership, which would help and support this brother or sister later in any legal dispute. So the urban and social trust was settled, and through the mobilization and legislative incidents our law was practically voted unanimously, and during this government, Fernanda will tell you about this. She's the Secretary for Social and Urban Integration, and this uh, construction and basic services are being supported by this government. Water, electricity, other basic services, as well as uh, plots with services, rural and urban areas, which is given to our brothers and sisters. In conclusion, I'd like to mention that when this mapping out was carried out, we had no help from academia. geographers or urban planners, it was very difficult to find architects to make these projects that work with the actual needs of the neighborhood. We met up with many anthropologists and sociologists that wanted to carry out participative processes, social surveys, circular surveys, but we did not find any people who were willing to simply change these plans to show where water and electricity will run through. And it was very similar in terms of the policies for the neighborhoods. It was all done among inhabitants and social workers, due to mainly lack of support by the by academia, because this brought up a lot of problems for us. It's different to map out something with the available tools of the geographic information systems that are free than to do this with people who well prepared people in the public university, which is paid by the Argentine government. So we had very little support by the academic sector. Popular movements and the academic sector did not work together much, not at least in terms of the real needs of the movement. So I will now give the floor to Fernanda, because I have to go. But what she has to say is much more important. So all the best. Congratulations to the organizers and a big hug to our brothers and sisters.
Sí, te
Thank
escuchamos.
you.
Hola, bueno, buenos días a todos y a todas. Soy Fernanda
Right.
Miño, soy
Good morning,
habitante de la
brothers and
ciudad de San
sisters.
Isidro. Tengo hoy
My
trabajo
name is Fernanda Mino. I live in San
de
Isidro. I am currently,
a
I work at the Social Urban Integration Secretariat, and I deal
hoy
with that area.
nada más y nada menos que explicar
As
un proceso que
our
se
brother Juan Grabois said, I'd like to talk about this process that led us to be militants for the neighborhoods. We, men and women, are the ones that raise the surveys, as one said, in the popular neighborhoods in 2016 and 17.
barrios. Éramos quienes
We joined this, well, this was an adventure that was necessary in order to collect information on the neighborhoods.
dar cada una de las
We, the militants and the academic sector,
Carlos,
created an app, and we knocked on doors to
adelante
raise information, which gave us necessary data, not
política.
exact data, but it was good enough for us to work with the different cases of government and policy. For us, it's very important to know that these policies were created in the poorer areas, in the bases,
Y el
by
acceso a
those who are invisible, not just due to poverty, but due to the lack of access to basic services and a small plot of land to live on with their families.
en mi casa del
Much
barrio La
beyond my function,
tengo que ir a cumplir
I am
trabajo de
currently in my house in La Cava, and we are delivering popular housing certificates. We're actually doing this today as well, so I have to speak very quickly
distintos
about
dispositivos
where we worked, and also I don't want to bore you. So
a cada barrio de
the plots were geo-referenced through apps sought by colleagues, so we could work with over 4,416 people, and now we're going to update
2016
these records because our survey only ran up to
todas las
2016. Now we're going to continue to 2016, 18,
mitad
and then all provinces in our country will be fully mapped out. We know
y
that
trabajamos
half of these neighborhoods are in Buenos Aires, near the capital, and we are working with a great challenge and a lot of sacrifice, because for a long time we have been working with closed policies with regard to popular areas. And this is necessary for the future. I see no sense today in working with different studies within the territory and going to the neighborhoods if there is no prospect transforming public policies, because a law can be beautiful on paper. Also, so can a study. It might be very precise and map out exactly how many neighborhoods exist or how many people live in them. But if that is not guided towards a public policy to transform a reality, it makes no sense. It just looks good on paper and is represents good intentions. This law that Juan mentioned is very important. It was a great victory, a great achievement after so many surveys, and we were able, through an organism such as LANCES, we were able to obtain these uh, habitation certificates or property certificates to give to these families. After law 2453, we can now say we are completely covered to work with in all neighborhoods of Argentina. So, as well as my origins and working in a neighborhood which doesn't have the regular services, a lot of work by the Steto Foundation, which was able to foment and enable this, CCT, Caritas, Evita movement, Movimento Evita, all these movements that took continue working based on and sometimes in spite of government initiatives. So I believe that is what I wanted to say. That is what I wanted to say, and I hope this is replicated in neighborhoods all over the world. May each study, and hopefully each time it's possible to work with a territory and we are able to reach a family, may this be translated into a public policy that can transform the lives of families.
Então eu passo a
Thank you,
palavra.
Fernanda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fernanda. Alfredo now speaking. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'd like to acknowledge all the brothers and sisters here. I'd like to start off with a small reflection regarding the social history of cartography and what it represents today. Pablo Mancilla shows in his book, Radical Cartography, which was recently republished in November last year, and the organization of which I'm part, this book tries to hold some of these reflections. Although, as Regis said, Luis Regis, our situation is that cartography is marked by incongruence, ambiguities, and it's a dubious concept. So I would like to work with this dubiety. Conventional cartography, Mancini already made a good retrospect. I won't go back to it. You know, nautical chartered started off the cartographical notion, right? I think that's important. Cartography is also, I think it's important to mention, when we talk about new social cartography, it's not an social cartography is not an adjective. It's an attempt to draw the attention to the time when social cartography was appropriated, when bank enterprises such as the World Bank and IDB, social mapping became two public companies such as Google. It became an opportunity to demonstrate their capability to map certain situations in the favelas, and Grabois spoke very well about this. In the case of Google, the little work with Afro Reggae in Rio de Janeiro is very important. And it so results that Afraregi is suing Google because Google is taking over the information
esse acesso às informações.
and does not leave access to information open. The idea of new social cartography, social mapping, is that it is not participative, because as Emerson himself said very well, participative means a place created by the agencies for people to participate. So it is a place that is destined. So social mapping is not um, participative as Google, so much so that it was sued. It's not collaborative. So this need nowadays, we have to make this distinction and show this new attitude. It's important not to confuse these new meanings. They cannot be confused with the meanings of maps as an instrument of domination, which the IDB, the World Bank, Google, and other agencies use in order to. Nowadays, we have many consultancy companies in our country who carry out social mapping for major projects, which became a planning instrument. When we mark the new mapping, it is to dialogue critically with these concepts and these meanings. So what is this new social mapping? As Emerson said,
Ela quer dizer, ela não é uma mera técnica, não é uma ferramenta, não é
it is not a technical tool, it's not a planning tool. It consists of a new mode of description of realities empirically observed, where cartographic representation using Mancilla's expression, it maps what is relevant of what is mapped out. The mapped out make the maps. Our social cartography does not devise maps. We just create the conditions so that people and communities, different social units, can produce the maps according to what they consider important. So in that respect, the awareness of the borders of each group coincides very much, very strongly with self-definition, the collective identity geared towards movement. This reflects the meeting of the communities with themselves. Social mapping allows this. All our maps, we've already devised more than 300 so far. It's kind of like a set, an identity kit. It shows the planning, it shows this to the planning entities. It's not counter mapping, because this is against the mapping of social cartography. And the bank, it's important that it be there. It's a new description. It's a new ethnographic mapping description. It's a concrete analysis of a real situation, which breaks with the conventional idea which is used by these agencies that we are drawing your attention to. With that, in that respect, the territory at play and the awareness of this territory is one that breaks with crystallization. It breaks with the rigidity which is given to the territory. Sometimes a map can precede a territory. When we see the partition of India, we see that the map of Pakistan precedes the existence of Pakistan. It's fantastic. So when India is partitioned, there was a map made by the British colonizers which anticipated Pakistan. So the map exists before the territory. That is also a discussion that exists as an element of domination. It exists. Another example is brought to us by Grabois and Fernanda, very, very masterly, which is the idea of the relationship between popular neighborhoods and territories, favelas, slums, and territories. We had an experience in Manaus with 28 indigenous settlements in the city of Manaus. When it is said that there are no, it is said there are no Indian villages in the towns. Based on GPS, social relationships, and contacts, we we saw that the territories are marked by social diversity. The territories are pluri-ethnical. In this respect, they do not correspond to a colonial situation. Colonial situation was dealt with by Regis, which is the one used by Banandier. Banandier tries to show us that this colonial action is the most important form, the one that best reflects the European expansion all over the planet. And it translates its brutal effects, such as in terms of the people submitted to it, as our peoples. If you think about South America, I don't want to say Latin America. I don't want to use that as a reference. I say South America, just like Amerindia was a complicated concept. The instruments that are used by domination. So Grabois, as we saw this survey on urban territories, we saw that they were multi-ethnic. We saw 22 different ethnicities in the same territory and over 13 languages, just to give you an idea. So this idea of a pluri-ethnical territory means that there is a people and a territory. Not necessarily. You can have one territory and many peoples, many ethnicities, many languages in it. So the idea of pluri-ethnicity or multi-ethnicity of the territories, you could use the pluricultural idea of territories. It opens up to a dynamic mindset. Territories are not to trap people. If we understand indigenous territories as fixed, these territories are dynamic. The first time that we went to a settlement, there were 5,000 people, then 15, then 20,000. There is no crystallization as such. When we immobilize our maps, that is what happens. For us, a map must be situational. They are always changing. That's why we call them like that, because they accompany the collective identity movements. And these identities, as Regis said, whose objective is social movements, this objective displaces the idea of territoriality. So I think to understand this process as a dynamic process, I think makes it an essential element to us. And in the Brazilian case from the 1988 constitution, this became very complex because today there is a recognition, acknowledgement of social diversity. The social life with, in terms of all types of peoples, we have theories. In the case of Candinemus, he says that the norms are not normal rules applied from the outside in to contents that are elaborated regardless of it, independently from it. These rules express relations of force, and they define a power and a territory. So there is priority over the content. There isn't. Quite the contrary, the dynamic affects the awareness of borders, frontiers. So this awareness of borders is also situational. It is variable. We have before us a world where situationality makes us ask, is everything relative? No. This theory helps us to acknowledge this movement. It enables our understanding of this movement, because the concept of resistance that is at stake, imbued within the new social mapping or social cartography, is that resistance means choice, thus an exercise of freedom. To resist means not to renounce building your own collective conscious. It means not relinquishing your collective assertiveness. After the Nazi occupation in France, I took this from Tassin, the Nazis wanted to mold the French and make them into passive objects, into a way they would be still men from the Nazi point of view, but robots, if you will. The resistance, the movement in France, was the choice in terms of how to react. It's the possibility for a reaction. So the political and organizational forms way that use masses, be a tribe, a community, a favela in Brazil, a settlement, um, an urban settlement, what when they present themselves, they are telling us this is a choice. This is a way we chose to resist. So I think that to break away with the crystallization of the map and not crystallize the idea of map is a central point of this reflection, always recovering the possibility of the dynamic aspect of things, which planning usually does not have. I think I spoke for exactly 10 minutes. I think that is the point that I really wanted to emphasize. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Vine, for your invitation. Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you very much. I have a few comments. I wrote down a few issues, comments, questions. So if you would like to further your comments, you can write it down on the chat, and Robson from technical support will work on them. Raquel.
Bom dia a todos.
Raquel. Good morning.
Estou aqui.
This is an excellent meeting. Congratulations. I'd like to just raise a quick issue, which is exactly the limit in terms of actual experiences that I have seen amongst us in Brazil in an urban setting, in terms of thinking in a conflicting planning, opposing what is being proposed, which is very important, through a collective subject construction process, but still encapsulated within the language of planning. I would like to go back to an issue that I put on the opening panel, but I think this is the place to talk about it, which is how the epistemology of the plan, its symbolization forms are not innocent, therefore connected to an idea and of a city territory. I understood very clearly through the work brought to us by Pablo how this is turned on its head when you work with a real. My provocation here is this, and I'd like to go back to what Juan said as well. I'd like to talk about mapping. What exists to mark out plots and properties? If in doing this, would we not be reforming the planning model that works based on individual plots and in individual private property, and make another proposal of alternative plan using the language of planning? In other words, not submitting to the extractivism theory. That is what I would like to ask. Thank you very much. I'd just like to bring that up for reflection.
Eu vou ler alguns comentários e questões do chat, depois eu
I'm
volto.
going to read a few comments from the chat, and then I'll go back to my colleagues, panelists, speakers, and then you can react and comment. So Joísa Barroso asks, how many properties remained in Villa Autódromo, and where were the remaining inhabitants resettled to? Rafael Alves asks, what do you think about the debate still in its beginning about the Central Rio fiscal exemption for public housing, public dwellings? Inês Anal asks about, what do you think about Porto Maravilha, or our Silicon Valley in Brazil. So also another panelist here proposed a corruption tour of Rio. Another comment, Fernando Aninho emphasized the Teto as a great world influencer on social impact. She also highlighted the cartographic analysis discussed here under the peripheral viewpoint. Diego Borges asks Professor Renato, saying, you mentioned the political dilemma in participative cartographical processes where subservient populations are subject to capital and may be overrun by panoptic mechanisms. How does Professor Alfredo understand this attention between the unprecedented view of traditional communities devising maps and making it a use instrument through softwares that usually serve major enterprises? Ana Fernandes asks, how do we understand the temporal aspect of collective work in the negotiation processes, also involving dispute and updating of issues?
É isso, gente. Então,
That's it. That's it. So I will now give back the word and comments to our colleagues.
Vamos lá, Regis.
Quem comienza?
Regis, pode ser?
¿Puedo comenzar?
Oi, posso começar? Não, achei, enfim, muito parabenizar todos os integrantes da mesa, né? O professor Alfredo Wagner chamou atenção para o papel das agências multilaterais.
Really drew our attention here to the aspect of social cartography, and I'd like to
atores estatais
also talk about the state actors and military institutions. Milton Gonzano studied the case of the indigenous peoples in Mexico, the Bauman expeditions, where you had an initiative that was kind of disguised with Americans coming in saying they were going to do participative mapping, and we ended up discovering that they were financed by the Office for Foreign Military Affairs. They were financed from military intelligence entities. In other words, they were not really interested in the privatization of the lands, but in terms identifying the individual plots
dos moradores, né? Então, assim,
for residents.
Também se produziu.
Also in Colombia, cartography was produced based on these relationships with the US Army, which also surreptitiously viewed to map out mineral resources, water, and the FARC participation. This ambiguity.
Esse campo, digamos assim, do mapeamento, das cartografias, né, dos quais a gente vem discutindo, né, aqui. Ou seja, eu acho que, enfim, a Raquel colocou uma questão muito importante, né, que é o limite dessas cartografias urbanas que vivem conectadas a esse modelo dominante do planejamento, e aí é muito, acho, da avaliação também, né, daqueles que são diretamente afetados e que são os protagonistas do mapeamento, que são as comunidades, né, que vivem em territórios muitas vezes sob ameaça e precisam de né, de um instrumento, ou se utilizam desse instrumento, né, como um elemento da sua luta política, né? Mas eu me lembrei também, né, a presença do Alfredo, assim, né, uma presença muito feliz para essa mesa, eu considero, né, porque ele é uma influência para todos nós, a Guerra dos Mapas, o projeto Nova Cartografia. E eu me lembrei, Alfredo, do caso do Sateré Maué, em Manaus, um dos fascículos, né, da Nova Cartografia Social, onde existe inclusive uma cartografia das migrações, e os Sateré Maué contam, né, cartograficamente como chegaram a Manaus a partir dessa narrativa, né, cartográfica e dessa territorialidade fluida, né? Ou seja, então, enfim, eu acho que é uma questão que a gente pode, de repente, considerar, né, inclusive, quando é o caso, nas cartografias que se dão em ambiente urbano, né? No caso da Joísa, a questão para onde foram as pessoas de Vila Autódromo, né? Ou seja, você teve aí, inclusive, se associa muito ao processo de mobilização, né, luta e negociação, o fato de que, né, assim, muitos receberam ofertas significativas no sentido de indenização e acabaram optando, né, por serem indenizados e adquirirem moradias em outras localidades, outros foram para programas Minha Casa Minha Vida, e aí você teve uma quantidade reduzida, né, de famílias que acabou lutando e decidindo pela sua permanência no local. E essa questão do uso do sistema de informação ligado às grandes corporações, a gente tem hoje também um grande movimento, né, que vai em direção à produção de softwares livres, né? Ou seja, então, eu acho que esse é um caminho, né? Ou seja, softwares livres, colaborativos, né, que passem ao largo aí dessas tecnologias de controle que a gente vê em corporações como o Google, como a Esri, né, que é uma grande corporação também envolvida no georreferenciamento, nos sistemas de informação geográfica. Mas é isso.
Obrigada. Eu queria só incluir mais uma questão que chegou, não pelo chat, que é de um colega que está acompanhando aqui, mas anônimo. Good day. My question concerns the idea and debate around counter mapping. In a recent volume called This is Not an Atlas, an interesting claim was made about the need not to include oppressed communities on the map, which might well constitute a piece of knowledge in the hands of oppressors, but rather to map the lines and processes of oppression. I would like the speakers to expand on that, if possible. Então, vamos lá, Renata.
Eu queria mais uma vez agradecer pela mesa, muito bom, muito rico o diálogo, as questões foram colocadas.
The issues that the plurality of issues are a reflex of this set of contradictions that we have in this attempt to appropriate the cartographic field by subjects that are well organized. Rafael and Anna mentioned the viewpoint of the territorial dispute and this duality, this dispute and the conflicts and projects and the renewal of the center. And he also asked about the new project from the municipal government in the new project by the mayor, Eduardo Paz, called the Mara Valley Port, where they will transform the port in the Silicon Valley of Rio de Janeiro. The two questions are complemented, showing a picture of projects dispute for this region. It's very difficult that they will prosper. because it's something that comes from the popular field, the hegemonic project for that region. We used to say the survey showed that it was 30,000 inhabitants, but it would come up to 100,000, removing the slums and the poor people who live there, all the poor occupations. So it's very clear that the hegemonic project for that is not for people's living there. It's for rich people, for Silicon Valley. And so one of the policies of culture for this transformation, this idea of Silicon Valley, even the mayor, Eduardo Paes, is trying to transform Rio into a bicentric city, attracting these kinds of companies or corporations for another district in Rio, Barra da Tijuca. We don't know if this will prosper in a crisis or pandemic scenario. The question that came in English saying, it has to do with what Regis mentioned of the search for more cartographic activism in the production of tools, and this capitalism of technological vigilance, where technologies will colonize and our lives, and with it comes tools not only for mercantilization and appropriation of our behaviors, and the tools of geolocalization, and a series of elements that we don't know. For instance, bets in games, and they become a merchandise to be sold. But most of all, to apprehend our behaviors and the quantity of applications we download are all tools. So I would say we need more activism, more cyber activism, hackers, and the dissemination of this among popular groups. And the example of this is the Institute Marielle Franco. They mapped popular initiatives to try and combat the social crisis of pandemic. The tool is based on Google producing maps. And Google is the company that refuses to give the localization and the data of the murderers of Marielle Franco. So it's within the hegemony of these great companies. So they appropriate this in the counter-hegemonic struggles, and they do not give us the information. So it's globalitarianism, like global militarism. And so the simple sphere of technical, social restraints to the behavior of people and social values. These companies control this means. So we should try and make activisms feasible or enable activisms. And we will continue to use this for some tools, for some struggles, but reinforcing other geometries for these power relations. We cannot exit this. It's not easy. Thank you, Renato. Pablo, please. Thank you. Well, I think Alfredo Wagner and Raquel Rolnick have mentioned some critical points for the debate. I'd like to mention four aspects that seem to be central in the cartography experiences. The first one is I agree, cartography must be understood as part of a process. And for us, cartography, social cartography is not only reduced to the workshop where you call out people, but we are always concerned about the first aspect, the performing power of the map, how it may disrupt, protest, and appear outside the workshop. We always finish our workshops saying, now we have the map, and now how are we going to discuss with whom? So the center of this protest, spatial protest, is the performing power of the map. Secondly, has to do with the participatory research that has to be concluded with political negotiations. And in this political negotiation, one of the central issues is the silences of the map. What will appear publicly and what will be contained only as a knowledge of the community. For example, in cartography we made in Cabo de Oros in Patagonia, with a community called Jaganes, the whole navigation struggles were taken away from the official map, so they could not pass on this knowledge. And the tourist information do not inform that. So I believe that there is an ethic issue around the map and how can you play with what is there and with what is a cult in the map. Lastly, the question by Raquel about what happens with these delimitations and if these territorial limits may come in as a way of understanding the territory as a territory ordainment, because as it appears in Latin America, the territory is at the center of the discussions. And in the Mapuche case, we no longer speak about land or recovering land, but recovering the territory. And when we talk about this, we want to we want to recover not only the land, but the relations with nature, etc. And I cannot extend too much, but there are two central things. First, this delimitation that we made in the maps correspond to the hydrographic basins, the river basins. So the rationale of limitation appears regarding the characteristic of the nature itself. It's not a limitation of the property of the land, but it's a true limit of the land. Secondly, is that we played with the concept of border from the Mapuche perspective, and their border concept is the place of meeting, the place in opposition to the idea of a border that separates, divides, but they see the border as something that is the uniting the two sides of the border. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to share with you all of this discussion. Thank you, Pablo. Juan, please. I don't know if Juan is there. Maybe he left. Maybe his connection fell. So Alfredo Wagner, please. Thank you, Fernanda. I would like to mention the importance of a reflexive analysis on the concept of social cartography and insist in the use of a new cartography, not as an adjective, but as marking a difference by the use of the domination of the dominance over social cartography. It's important to have this difference. At the same time, it's a utopian struggle and a concrete struggle. I'd like to show the new possibilities. It's not so new. The freedom of Haiti, the first country to free itself from colonialism, happened through mappings too. There are information. I read that in C.A. James in Carpentier in Haiti. I talked to people about its historical consciousness of their territoriality. And with the prison of Dessalines, there is the possibility of the mapping becoming a concrete issue of the natural picture. This allows them to win over 100,000 Napoleon forces, army forces. This victory is so expressive under the point of view of a national liberation movement. And it was through the maps. So the disruption with the cartographers, and Jorge Luis Borges speaks about this, it starts with this example of Haiti, which is very important. And after that, and I tell people about this, about demarcation, etc. Carpentier said, what arrived in Haiti after that were those who measured the land, the agrimeter, they measure the land. We should also rethink when Regis mentioned in a very nice way the idea of their experiment. From then on, we began to produce a notion of specific territoriality, not only territoriality, but specific ones that could contemplate the dynamics, the situations, and the displacements of identities. In the case of the experience of Alcântara, with 150 quilombola communities. So for 40 years, we've been winning the military with our maps that we produce together with the communities. So this is fundamental in the conflict. 40 years of duration, and they cannot defeat us with this data. It's important to end the idea of the counter mapping, the idea in the atlas, although we have participated in this atlas of the orangutango in Germany, we think that our colleagues are prisoners of the limits. Maybe this is Raquel's question, of the limits imposed by the colleges of cartographers. The military here tried to institute that who could map in Brazil was only the military, not the universities. And we defeated that. So I think that this struggle and who has the monopoly, we were able to break this. So the limit of these concrete experiences, we decided to overcome, incorporating the idea of strengthening their own knowledge of their territories. So now we have 3 experiences of center of knowledge and science. There are indigenous museums that we produced with 400, 500 pages, only with those experiences and showing how original knowledge, taxonomy in the interpretation of this knowledge, and is an element of rupture. And now the last thing, it's our relationship with the cartography to Rio de Janeiro. We did it through the Association of Slum Residents. We have done with Alemão, in Maré, Rocinha, those are all names of slums, and Caxias. So There, they are also making experiences of museums. There are museums in all of these slums. So the territory summed up, the territoriality summed up with traditional knowledge replaces utopia. It replaces utopia, opening up a possibility of reflecting the act of mapping. I think this is important. This is what disrupts the ideology of planners that today uh, dominate the mega projects, whether it's the port of Maravilha or the another port in Rio, or ports in Itacoatiara, Solimões, or Madeira. In the Carajás halls, these idea of mega projects, they strengthened the idea of mapping, whether it's in India with the New Delhi Mumbai Hall, in corridors from Kenya until Sudan. And I'm very sorry that I did not suggest a colleague from Kenya that could participate and tell you that it would complement these reflections most of all of the people of Kenya who won over the state in the African court, and it opens possibility for the understanding of their territory, transcending the geometry and incorporating the utopia, and showing that the concrete is not separate. The natural and the supernatural are not separate, they are together. Those are the maps of the enchantment in the case of the Amazon, where the supernatural figures are part of the geometry. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I extended too much. Thank you very much, Alfredo Vargas, on behalf. I'd like to thank you very much for this wonderful panel. We will have a small break now of 5 minutes, but I would like to thank very much the enormous contribution of all of you, all the communication. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, pessoal.
A gente retorna, então, às 10h50. Ok, pessoal? Para a próxima sessão. Que eu vou...
Combinado.
Valeu, Alfredo. Um abraço. Muito bom te ver. Pablo também. Acabar isso, eu volto aqui no Rio, né?
Sim, muita saudade do Rio.
Um abraço também, Pablo. Depois eu vou te pedir o material, tá?
Sim.
Muito interessante.
Renato, a gente pode ficar aqui nessa sala ou tem que sair e voltar?
Eu acho que fica, né, Fabrício? A gente fica nessa,
pode ficar?
Né?
Pode.
Isso, a gente fica.
Vamos ficar nessa sala aqui, tá bom?
Olha, fecha um pouquinho.
Vamos ficar nessa sala mesmo, pessoal. Só esperar um pouquinho, 5 minutos.
Fernanda, o Stavros está aí?
O Stavros esteve com a gente. Deixa eu ver se ele está aí.
Como é que você
eu
acha
mandei um
ele?
recadinho para ele pelo chat.
Mas como é que você acha ele?
Deixa eu ver aqui nos participantes. Tem participantes e tem attendees.
Não, aqui tem panelistas e attendees.
Ele não está agora. Ele não está. Ele esteve. Agora ele não está.
Uhum. Ok, tá. Vou beber uma água e já volto.
Legal.
Linda mesa, hein? Muito boa, hein? Muito boa mesmo.
Adorei. Muito, muito. Adorei.
Caralho!
Renato? Oi, Renato. Está me ouvindo? Renato? Está me ouvindo?
Professor Carlos, só estou eu aqui.
Estou ouvindo, Weiner.
Achei muito boa essa colocação do Alfredo, que os territórios não são cristalizados.
Uhum.
Achei isso daí muito, muito interessante, entendeu? Muito, muito interessante.
Uhum. Ele o veio antropológico dele, né? O lado antropólogo dele. Ele aciona o Frederic Barth. Os grupos étnicos e suas fronteiras.
Como mapa.
Weiner, Renato?
Oi, fala isso.
Não, pessoal, tem que ver se com o Robson se ele já botou todos os palestrantes aqui, eu não estou vendo.
Não, aqui estou batendo papo, não estou palestrando.
Não, sei, Weiner, mas já passou da hora, só isso.
Tudo bem, então eu vou ficar quieto, tá bom. Depois a gente conversa.
Ele está aí, o Fabrício? Robson?
Tá, acho que está.
Porque eu acho que ele vai habilitando, não sei se ele está com a ordem.
Isso, eu tenho a ordem, sim. Agora vai ser isso.
A Simone, isso. A Simone está pedindo Para eu passar um filme dela, ou ela mesma pode passar?
Ela mesma pode passar. Nós temos aqui agora Aline Sanches e Simone Poli, depois a Ana Clara Guiar Maciel.
Isso. Tá. Ok. Vamos começar, então? Podemos? Começamos, Fabrício?
Vai, pode.
Bom, então vamos dar início à nossa sessão de apresentação dos trabalhos que foram enviados.
Let's start the presentation of the documents that were selected to be presented. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 works that are going to be presented in the session, and then we'll have a discussion. The first one is cartography of social action, mapping solidarity by Simone Poli. 5 minutes, okay. Good morning to all of you. Considering the objective presentations, we recorded the presentation and I'll try to share it with you. And then, Renato, tell me if you can hear and listen and see. Okay, can you see the presentation? Yes?
Tá sem som.
There's no sound. No, there's no sound.
Peraí, só um instantinho.
Quanto a Simone arruma, eu só queria fazer um adendo, assim, esse artigo não foi só
I
escrito por
just
mim.
would like to add that this article was written by myself and Simone and also 2 other people. 4 people did this work. I'm sorry, I missed the 2 other names. We are trying to present here and have the sound. No. No. I'll try again.
Sim, agora entrou.
Now we have the presentation. I'm going to speak because the audio didn't come in well. So we are going to tell you the experience of the mapping of solidarity, which is a map that initially started as an extension of the university studies. The idea is to connect territories or social groups that are under vulnerable situations with low income in the metropolis of Curitiba. We know the pandemic does not affect everyone equally. These are the social groups, the ones that are most affected because of their low income, and they are unequally affected by the effects of the disease, by their low income conditions, and work and housing in Paraná. So we work with Curitiba and the municipalities around the metropolitan region. And this was the request that came to us through social movements, especially Sefuria, that had met with other movements, people who collect scavengers that collect recyclable materials, and they had an impact because they could not work. So together with independent workers, we tried to elaborate a map that could represent what they were already developing in a decentralized way in the territory. So the idea is to give visibility to the difficulties of certain groups in this group of small actions of women, community kitchens, and to be an instrument of pressure and denouncement to the public agencies. Nothing was being done regarding the impact over the income of the family. So this is basically, it's a map that was mapped based on the popular organizations with 2 types of language. One of them is the actions that are being carried out, and trade unions, universities, they were all trying to give support and strengthen some of the community kitchens and some of the actions to distribute food and the cleaning materials. On the side, we can see what is the campaign, how to help, how many family possible donors. And so the role of territoriality is very strong in the situations of survival of the area, which is the need they told us in small initiatives. The idea was also to give visibility to other fundraising actions that are still happening as lives for institutes, trade unions, collectives that continue to happen until today. So here in the picture on the right side, you have Sindipetro, the trade union of oil workers. They are donating food from the land reform communities that produce food products. And on the left side, the consolidation of community kitchen. Here's another food community or community kitchen, strengthening the donation of food through these kitchens. At the same time, we started to use the data and they asked us to cut cross them with the density, demographic density, income, so that we can observe the different layers of the population in the territory.
Cartografia social.
So we have an information from the social cartography based on their reality and others that we add to them. So the idea is to initially, the work is being used today as a tool, pragmatic tool with social characteristics, so we can look ourselves in the map and have the possibility of getting more food for these collective kitchens. We use a tool called sorry, I missed the name, but it's a very easy tool to use in the internet. And during the elaboration, we didn't think about strategies to evaluate its effectiveness. The donations were free. We only tried to, through the mapping, we tried to connect these two types of information, and the social movements and organizations and groups that participated with us use these tools in order to disseminate it massively in their networks. And it's not being used, but we have an internal discussion and the organization of the social struggle. There is also a demand by these organizations of a municipal plan as their agenda that has been happening.
Já devo ter estourado. Obrigada.
I must have gone over my time. I think sorry and thank you. Thank you, Simone. Just went. The next speaker will be about a study of the advances of COVID-19 in the popular areas of the city of Niterói. Ana Clara Maciel and Marcele Gomes are both there who will be speaking. Mariel de Souza and Glauco Bielenstein. So you have the floor.
Bom dia, gente. Meu nome é Marcele, eu sou bolsista do Núcleo de Estudos e Projetos.
Good morning, my name is Marcele. I'm a scholarship holder, and Ana Clara will present our work on the cartography of the conflicts on the pandemic,
Covid-19
a
nas áreas
study about the advance of COVID-19 in the popular areas of the city of Niterói. Now we're going to briefly describe the city. Niterói is in the metropolitan area of the state of Rio de Janeiro and borders with Maricá and São Gonçalo towns, and is connected to Rio through the Rio-Niterói Bridge. Our presentation comprised the following. Niterói is a city of contradictions. On one side, it is presented as an intelligent, high quality of living city, and was eulogized by its quick response to COVID. The population faces very basic problems, since there's water shortage and also the bad distribution of the social rent allowance. Here we see the city. This first map shows us the main circulation tracks. We understand that this data is important in order to understand the dissemination of coronavirus in Niterói. So it's more intense in the bitter. This is the medium, the average distribution of the population. Most of Niterói's population is in between 0 and 3 minimum wages, and the other side shows the other. We use the average of 3 inhabitants per domicile, and Niterói is much higher than that in most of its territory, which is a factor that makes more serious the dissemination of the virus. In order to do this, we use the data made available by the local city council on Facebook. So we also accompanied news on the pandemic, such as we applied questionnaires and interviews to the inhabitants of popular areas, especially in the Forum for the Struggle for Housing, which seeks the access to the city and is advised by the public powers. In this first map, we show the cases on April 2nd, 2020. All the colors are based on the cases by population densities. Each district has a different population. In the first map, we compare the greater sectors. Here we have the sectors with higher income. In the 3 first weeks, most neighborhoods that showed cases of COVID were those with high income areas, and the central areas connected via the ferry to Rio and the connection to the northern districts of the area of the city. So we have metropolitan and municipal connections. In the second figure, we see the cases of 30th of January, 2 months ago, and compare with inhabitants per domicile, as Marceli said, 3 inhabitants per domicile. And here we have something interesting. We see that all the neighborhoods that have over 100 cases per 1,000 inhabitants, in other words, over 10%, are districts that also present a high index of high rate of inhabitants per domicile. This, it's not just because it's a neighborhood with a high population density means that it will have a high COVID incidence, but this helps with this propagation, and access to income and work and access to information is also compromised. In the questionnaire that we ran, responded by about 40% of the communities in Italy, we see that 58 of the answers showed that the inhabitants had variable income. So they complemented their income with odd jobs and thus were not able to socially isolate or socially distance, especially now with the end of the federal government assistance. We had a lot of fake news on the WhatsApp groups, in the community and the family groups, The 16 families that were evicted during the 2020 elections, during the pandemic, in other words, they also allege delay in receiving their income supplement. We are able thus to trace a small panorama of the unequal city that Niterói is. Some factors show this inequity in the way the pandemic was dealt with. We believe that our work can be a tool for struggle, which is who we did work for, the forum inhabitants. That's what I had to present. Thank you. Thank you, Marceli and Ana Clara. Next presentation is cartography as an instrument of investigation in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Jessica Cortes, Ana Beatriz de Araújo. Jessica, you have the floor. Ellen will present the screen and I will coordinate my presentation.
Bom dia, eu sou a Jéssica Cortes e como eu
Good
disse,
morning, my name is Jessica Cortes and I will present our work. Fernanda Sanchez organized it. We are from the Federal University of Rio, UFF. This is about the port zone of Niterói, which has a lot, is very historically relevant for Rio de Janeiro. This is the Porto Maravilha, marvelous port project. With different interests, there are many conflicts. We understand that as the main conflict was the problems we see there. This is an instrument. We wanted to investigate these conflicts. Some populations were greatly harmed by this, and this contributed towards the mercantilization of this area. We mapped official data, which sometimes in blue, we have the urbanistic area, which has the more flashy works. We have in orange, we have some of the favela areas. In the center, we have the area which foments inequity even more. And in purple, we have the cultural protection area. We notice that these limits move together.
Que tem sua importância histórica reconhecida pela própria PAC, e o Rio Novo, que é essa área crescida por aterros ao longo do tempo.
The area known as the landfills. To understand what is really going on in the port zone, we mapped out the in yellow and the markets in orange, with spectacular monuments made to create a good image to show the so-called marvelous city. Based on these data, we see that the day-to-day life is concentrated in the areas around this marvelous port area. The poorer populations are essential for this area to work, but the investment is outside of this nucleus. A lot is necessary in order to show this. I now give the floor to Vitória Conrado.
A Vitória não está habilitada ainda para falar.
É possível fazer essa...
Robson, eu estou pedindo para o Robson, que é o nosso suporte técnico, para ele habilitar.
I'm just asking our technical support to enable Victoria to speak. Victoria to speak.
Oi, Robson.
Olá, olá.
Você pode habilitar, a Vitória Conrado vai apresentar também, você pode habilitar ela como painelista?
Sim, habilitando. História promovida.
Oi, vou continuar aqui. Um minuto. Bom, na terceira etapa de mapeamento, a gente focou nos agentes.
We are showing the agents that contribute towards the area. From the 20th century, we see habitational emptying. There is a lot of infrastructure and job opportunities. This is directly related to the recurrence of housing alternatives. In spite of the stigmatization about these types of housing, where they are never officially mapped, we mapped based on existing surveys. In purple, we have the tenements, the removals in red, and our area is concentrated in its nucleus.
Olhando para isso, a gente consegue
The
perceber
outer areas, Rio, Marvel, as we've said before, receive most investments. The Porto Maravilha is invested towards the rich, and there is an attempt to erase the poorer areas. Finally, we mapped the urban spaces, voids, based on the social interests, habitation interests. Amongst the 40 idle plots,
realizado, então a gente
no housing enterprise was left out. We saw that a lot of land was wasted due to lack of investment, and a lot of the corporate attempts have a difficulty to become active because of the gray areas that these urban cutouts create. Our future objective is a new proposal for an urban project for this area, and the mapping was important for us to understand the existing conflicts and to raise awareness of these housing alternatives that exist there. I would like to end it here. Thank you all for your attention. And we'd like to emphasize the importance of cartography and mapping to materialize these relations that exist in the space, and also to emphasize discourses that are historically silenced. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. Next presentation, the marker of the meeting areas. Now, Aloysio Marino will speak. Good morning, Professor Renato. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. It's great to talk here at a table where our predecessors are our references. Professor Alfredo with the new social mapping, even you, Professor Renato, talking about the mapping cartographical activism. You are all references for my work. It's a pleasure and a great responsibility to be sharing with you these experiences. I have just come out of COVID, so I'm going to speak in 5 minutes, but I apologize if I go over a bit. What I want to present to you is the mapping of the feeding areas. This is for people who are living in the streets or without housing. This is meal alternatives for these people. So it's called the mouth feeding areas. It shows that there are many closed areas, the opportunity for this population to find food, and this became more difficult. But this experience of mapping out the mouth feeding areas, was made by the Mundaréu da Luz Forum. I'm going to share my screen with you now so that you can learn a bit more about this work and how we devised the map. Can you see it? Confirm, please. Can you see it now on your full screen? Yes. Okay, thank you, Professor. So, the Mundaréu da Luz Open Forum involves institutions, collective gatherings and movements, and the work is that of resistance and proposal for the central area of São Paulo city, where we have the famous crackland, Cracolândia. It's not just an Euclidean territory, it's a flow of people. So the message at the beginning showed where the flow is going. That is why it's so important where it asks that, because the flow of Crackland, Cracolândia, in the last few decades, it has been moving around this territory based on urban interventions and extreme police violence. And this displacement within the territory acts as an element for the wasteful land, real estate speculation. There's a lot of conflict in this area, as you can imagine. This conflict became even more evident in May 2017, when then Mayor João Doria carried out many violent interventions where he demolished buildings with people living in them in order to carry out a PPP intervention for hospitals and modern buildings. He displaced around 300 families among demolitions and removals. Just to give you an idea, these families had to go to many areas of the town, but they remain basically downtown. They live in abandoned buildings. You see that downtown is still a very popular territory, which is an interesting thing to show here in this work. This is the map of the mouth feeding area. Just to highlight here a few parts of this process. The article has more details. First, when we mapped out the mouth feeding areas, this didn't happen during the pandemic. This is an older project, and it has maturing. There are meetings between the speakers and the users. This is the map of the tramps, as they call it. A lot of waste collection for recycling, mouth feeding areas. But this never happened because autonomy is respected. It's very much based on the new social cartography, the autonomy of the cartographer. These are people carrying out the surveys, not just me. And this must use language that respects these autonomies. So the mouth feeding areas, the language is an example of this. So this is showing what happened during the pandemic. It's very interesting because it was also used as a territorial intervention. We went to the area, taking pictures. This is part of the landscape of the area. You see that some of these notices have been peeled off by the military police. These posters generated conflict. The police tried to remove them, and they couldn't remove them easily because it's very well stuck, but there was conflict. At the same time, it generated conflict. It generated important collaborations. People, the fact of being able to see themselves on the map, this had very interesting consequences for the Doctors Without Borders, and they were able to work more precisely, and they asked us to map out the hospitals in order to guide these people to go and seek assistance. So it was a simple idea, yet it was very rudimentary, yet it was very important to create awareness of the territory. And this can be transported to other things. The knowledge of those who live in the streets should be based on a public policy for those who are homeless. Sorry if I went over my time, Renato, but it's difficult to speak in 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Aloysio. This is a bit different from. Now we have Gustavo Soares and Luisa Eduardo and Daniele Regina Pontes. Are the three of you enabled? Vinicius, Gustavo.
Bom dia. Então, eu e o Gustavo, hoje, a gente vai tentar contar um pouquinho dessa experiência desse trabalho que a gente vem desenvolvendo há um ano. Então, meu nome
We
é
have been
Vinícius.
working on this for a year. My name is Vinicius. We're on now.
Do projeto de
I am a
extensão
member of the extension project
comunitários em
of the Federal University of Paraná, which is about the community mapping in
formado por
our resistance experiences. Our group has
engenharia,
students, professors from the fields of engineering, architecture, geography, and also law. To tell you a bit about this process, I will start off by presenting a brief history of the conflict area. So this area belongs to the federal government, Capão do Cipó. It's in the municipality of Castro in the state of Paraná, has around 440 hectares. This area was used for free during 44 years by entities connected to the business, agribusiness, the region's agribusiness. And the last 14 years, 2001 to 2015, the use was irregular. So then the union comes in with eviction, with a foreclosure, even with a manifestation of Inca's interest to transform this area into an area of settlement in 2014. In 2015, the landless movement, MST, occupies the area, and then the Maria Rosa do Contestado settlement arises. Then the the federal prosecutor's office comes in with, again, an attempt to evict those living illegally in the area, according to them. Here, we'd like to highlight that when the landless movement occupies, the things change drastically. It was used for transgender and weed kill experiments. It became 100% organic area with agricultural cooperatives. Many gains in terms of social and environmental impact were carried out, and there's a lot of in 2020, when the public defender's office came in and carried out a study in order to carry out shared use among settlements, the training center, and the public government, the municipal government. One of the lines of analysis here was through the mapping of the soil use. We carried out a historical survey of the uses, and we have satellite images showing the different types of use throughout time. So we show here the impacts and the gains. There was no environmental negative impact, but we saw a lot of social gain and biodiversity gain in the area. Another line we used, an analysis of the area by institute. We compared it to the institutes of the state of Paraná, occupy 50 hectares and offer about 10 courses, whereas the larger areas had 400 odd courses, hectares, and only offered 5 courses. Another important issue was the difference. The area is located in the rural area of the municipality, whereas in most of the state of Paraná, most of the territories are inserted in the urban area. Another element that we analyzed was the directive plan. The area of the settlement is within the blue circle. The macro zoning is a consolidation area for agribusiness. So urban use was not predicted or planned. We also saw that the current occupation of the areas through agroecology follows what the base plan said. In other words, they wanted to fight pollution, sustainable development. So all these elements also recently inherited the ability to show the FPR to give up on the area. The process continues, but all this contributed towards the IFPR relinquishing this.
né? Então, nesse trabalho, ela se deu através do uso crítico das
We'd
ferramentas
like
do
to highlight some of the subversive use of cartography. The settlers mapped out the areas through GPS, and we also wanted to build a stability dialogue where the settlers were able to use their cartographical markings and use it in their defense.
E também novo papel aí
We also see a new role
os juízes
within the legal context where lawyers can help with better analysis and action in the land conflicts. Thank you.
Obrigado, Gustavo Vinícius.
Thank you, Gustavo and Vinicius.
Só interromper o compartilhamento de tela de vocês aí. O último trabalho dessa sessão é o trabalho luta pela permanência e democratização das ferramentas de planejamento territorial, reflexões acerca das estratégias de resistência a processo de remoção, né? E tem como autora, vai apresentar, Thalita Anzei Gonçalves.
Olá,
Good
morning. I'm here. I'm going to share screen.
Vocês estão enxergando?
Sim.
Bom, então, bom dia, meu nome é Thalita, eu sou do Observatório de Emoções, do Lab Juta da UFAB.
And with this enormous title, I'm going to speak very briefly and make an absurdity to reduce many cases and try to focus on certain issues that I had tried to discuss in my research for my doctorates, my PhD. I will speak about 3 cases, but it's not a comparative analysis. It's the experiences that use practices of insurgents mapping in the struggle for their land against removal. These 3 experiences end up developing into a struggle for permanence, but not just any permanence, but a qualified one with a shared and collective struggle, aiming at building autonomy through the democratization of the technical knowledge. So very briefly, the first case, the community of peace in Itaquera, in the east zone of São Paulo. At a first moment, they were threatened by the arrival of the World Cup. That was a threat, though it wasn't exactly because of the stadium, but because it was so close to the stadium, they wanted to make a park on top of that slum. So the residents organized, and based on the autodromo experience, they articulate with many groups, the popular committee for the World Cup, to think about a strategy, which was the first plan on the left side, which is very simple, though it was not implemented officially. It ends up following, until the present moment, the guidelines of the plan, though the city government says it could not be implemented at that moment. But in 2017, they have another threat of removal, the East Zone corridor that would go above their slum. So based on their previous experience, the residents, and with a small participation of the technical groups, they propose an alternative design, and they are able to resist until today the threats of removal, discussing not only the strategy, but also forms of building the city. The second case is Campos Elíseos in the cracked land that my colleague has already mentioned, and this is one of the developments of the forum, and it was the Plan Campos Elíseos Live, or Living in Campos Elíseos. And it's more detailed in terms of technicalities, and there's more resources with values and everything. But at this moment, the um, playgrounds are being removed, although they have resistance and they continue to resist until now.
Ana Clara, Marcelo, Daniel e Glauco, né? É importante esse trabalho. Eu convido a apresentar na sessão extraordinária da Comissão de Saúde da Câmara de Niterói, que vai ocorrer amanhã, dia 24 às 14 horas. Né?
Meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m.
Uma frente, né, de disputa.
One more struggle front for you to participate. Professor Glauco would also like to speak. Glauco Bienenstein. Right. Good morning, good afternoon to all. I'd like to congratulate all the presenters for this sensational, marvelous synthesis by Professor Renato, as usual. Needless to say, I would like Anna, no, I really mean that. I'd like Anna and Marceli to develop a bit, elaborate a bit more, albeit briefly, regarding some issues relating to their survey. Just a quick announcement. Another project be presented tomorrow about the cartography of the struggles in Niterói, which liaises a lot with this work. The work that was presented. Tomorrow's project is an extension project. So, Nini and Marceli, please talk about the situation in Niterói, active solidarity. Thank you, Renato, once again, and congratulations on your mediation.
Claro, acho que a gente pode, talvez na ordem, pode, Simone.
Eu só queria solicitar a liberação da
Yes,
câmera.
I would just like to request the audio and the camera to be enabled for Carolina and Alessandro. I think they had a problem there on site and their names are not there, but they are authors, so I would like them to take part in the debate. Please make that possible.
Poderia liberar para eles também.
By technical support, if you could enable their participation as well.
Não sei se...
Não, pode ir comentando enquanto isso.
I can also pitch in with a comment. Yeah, during that time, while our technician Robson works on enabling the other participants. Right, Simone.
Sobre o que foi colocado aqui,
with regard to what was mentioned here, Renato, you said very well when you spoke about mapping information hidden, some that are not released. So there is a clear dispute going on. On the map shown, we tried to map out actual action, and the difficulty to map the action is, as Wagner said, this action is dynamic. Our map is definitely already out of date. It doesn't show all the actions, but that was not our main objective. To show an updated map with everything spick and span. The idea was to show the map dynamics and essentially that it can serve in the political struggle. For the groups to be recognized in the many areas, and so that indeed what was collected was distributed where it should. I just like the categories that Alfredo mentioned about the confirmation of the new territorial aspects and the new actions. This map has a few limitations in that respect, but it was widely used by those who asked us for it. And the fact of having now this greater facility of online instruments, and the pandemic has brought that up. It separates us from the territory. You are not able to gather, cause agglomerations, get together with people to talk. So there's this dubious aspect. I don't know if anyone else would like to pitch in.
Acho que a gente pode comentar, então, a pergunta do
Sim,
Paulo.
pode.
Well, we will comment on Glaucus' question. Right, I'll complement here. So, good morning.
Questionamentos, né? Sobre a divulgação dos
With
dados.
regard to the also on Facebook,
Divulgar no mapa por
I'd
estado.
like to
E a gente acredita que essa não é a forma mais eficiente de divulgação desses dados.
this is not the most efficient way to disseminate these data because in the districts, in the neighborhood, there are many different aspects. So, for example, we are not able to locate the cases in the special social interest areas in other communities. We can't go exactly where we want, when we want. And also they stopped disseminating the data in February, not just in Niterói, but other municipalities. We have noticed that as well as data dissemination having decreased, they also reduced the covidometer, that, as it became known in Rio. Hey, last year in Niterói, when social distancing ended, it changed its way of the actual COVID meter. The opening of new beds availability, the availability of beds was more openly disseminated than the incidence of the disease. Now we are moving on to other municipalities in the interior of the state of Rio. I think that's it, Marceli, isn't it? We would also like to highlight the fact that we had a lot of active we are talking to, who are the judges of the action. So how do they read the elements put before them by the agents who are there fighting over that territory? And there's no real solution, easy solution, because law in this case is very conservative minded, and we're going to have to work with this liaison member so that they can read based on a certain type of language. So we will use the resources that are available, both for us as for the settled, because the settlers are the one who are going to raise this data, because we are in a pandemic. So we have short and fast learning periods. We have to learn quickly because the lawsuit is running, is happening, and the lawsuit is progressing every day. It doesn't just stop. So we need to seek normative cartography. That's why we use we need to have a main plan showing the urban areas, which can lead to the action and must be understood by the judicial branch in order for us to reach a result. And this generates some very interesting results. The Federal Institute of Paraná, which was there to work for those that were, let's say, more privileged, and this creates a kind of a distortion of the zoning. And there is an interesting movement. The judge sometimes decides if it's well documented. The judge goes to the area. They say, I'm not going to make a decision if I don't know the area. So legal discussions sometimes, if they were well documented, the judges made a point of actually understanding what they were judging. So they went there sometimes. So this is all in a very hostile area. So we must see other possibilities, which are not just seeing something in writing, and there are many levels of power involved. So it was possible, based on all these elements we have mentioned, to follow this lawsuit. As Vinicius and Paulo said, it is not resolved, but there is gain in with respect to the fact that there is no security or no definition that the judicial branch will decide neutrally. I'm talking from the side of the law and the settlers. Thank you, Daniele. Yes, it's difficult to see a judge leave their quarters to go to an actual place and see for themselves. Aloysio, Aline, and then Ite will speak.
Especially in this moment of pandemic, it's good to have a space for us to meet. It's so much. I'd like to comment one specific thing that I think puts together everything that was mentioned here as in the opening session, which is the scales. We use scales in such a way that the criticism of Lacoste already brought that. We use scales as if it was a common sense, academic common sense, local, regional, national, international. These scales don't have a very clear definition. So we end up operating this technique without reflecting critically what it means. What does it mean? A local scale that includes a municipality, a district, or a specific place? And what is the notion of the scale in the epistemology of the planning of the cartography? So Daniela brings this, the judge went to the scale of the site. So this is part of epistemology. So it's fundamental, the criticism of epistemology to criticize the scales problem and reconfigure this. It's my challenge in my PhD to think about the alternative of planning based on the scales. And in COVID, this was very clear to me. The scale of official cartography as public policies to combat COVID is completely outside the territory. While you have incredible actions, the state is disarticulated and cannot think about the scale of the body of the place. And the pandemic also opened up this detachment from the public policy and the planning situation. So we can work with maps, but without working with scales, this is impossible. Aline, please. I'd like to comment what was mentioned about the graphic issue. In the solidarity map we established, the actions were coming up at the same time the social movements began to bring up. And so we tried to adapt what we had according to these demands. All the actions we made were according to the actions that were taking place. In the beginning, we thought about platforms to disseminate it, what would be the best form to articulate this. So we looked for practical issues in order to show what we were mapping, what was the demand of these movements and what they wanted to show in this map. Finally, even Google was criticized at the beginning. So we ended up doing this so anybody who had access could deal with this, but not everyone has access to internet and is able to have this control. But we could see that we wanted the most simplified form so that everyone could modify it. We rethought and rethought it according to the new information that came up. In general, the graphic issue is always a review on top of the demands that are happening so that we don't block it because the state is already very blocked. If we established something in the beginning and thought about it, it seems like we will not continue in the way the action demands. So we tried to adapt this language, but the representation, the dissemination according to what was demanded at the moment. Because as everybody else did, everything that happened were surprising. Some actions were very fast. The campaigns that we mapped was one action. The next day it had more other articulated groups. And it's just not one movement, but 8 or 10 movements. So how can we map that? So we always rethought about this and included more and more. Last year, we always had a continuous development, and cartography is important to be articulated with what is happening. It cannot be something fixed, though we were using the Google Maps platform. So we were constantly updating it so that we could get to the identity of the movements at different situations and show the political articulation. If Simone would like to complement something, or Carola. That's my contribution. Very briefly, relate the scale that was mentioned, which was also a concern about in the map of solidarity, associations of residents. We were concerned about mapping the actions that were happening in that territory in terms of vulnerability. Just complement this. This was a concern. And we end up representing this in different points of campaigns or points. There were many campaigns that we had the Solidarity SA where they show everything in the global TV. We wanted to focus on the people who were in the territory, the association of residents, or someone, a group that was in a specific slum or an institute that was doing something. So we know that the great corporations don't need any more advertising. We were thinking mostly about the political struggle, the Talita and Jessica, please. Jessica, you closed up this session in a wonderful way, valuing the public university, the federal university, and in an engaged form, committed with the social change, with a society that continues to be one of the most unequal in the planet, and a population that is disgraced by the that was disgraced by these hegemonic governments we've had for 500 years, with different forms of hyper exploitation and racialized, etc., using our bodies, our cultures, and our forms of experimenting the world. Your speech is closing this with a golden key. It was excellent. Thank you very much. I thank you all very much for having stayed here, and we will come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, no, at 9 o'clock. Thank you all for presenting your work for our struggle. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Bye. See you tomorrow, 9 o'clock. See you tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and congratulations to all.
Tchau, obrigada. Esquece não, né?
Thank you very much. Glauco never misses a comment. Thank you all very much. Bye. See you tomorrow. My monitor.
Arrasou.
We are very proud of you. Thank you. Bye.